Welcome to the third session of our new normal series from Faith Baptist Church. Today I am in my kitchen instead of my office. Had some equipment challenges that brought me into this space instead. But we're going to carry on and I think go to some interesting places with this series today, because this is all about being intentional with what comes next. The old normal that we knew before coronavirus it's not coming back, not completely. And so as our world opens up in the wake of the pandemic, there is this rare opportunity to take a fresh look at the way we were living before and why. Some things that we may just be itching to get back and can't wait, but there may be other parts of your old life that were not working. And now you have had this chance to stop and reflect and think about how to change some things as you head into a new normal. So the question we've been asking is, what do you want your new normal to look like? Now, so far we've introduced this series. We've talked a little bit about some of life's big questions and how our beliefs drive our behavior. Those earlier sessions are available on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page. If you haven't checked those out, you can see the video description for links. Today is about relationships, and I thought, well, that might be a good fit for Father's Day. And these last few months have been a major time of relationship stressors for some people, and hopefully some relationship blessings, being close with a small number of people for some others as well. You might have had a harder time staying connected to some of your most important people while you were limited to phone or video chat or letters for those who still send those. And that can lead to loneliness. On the other hand, some of us have been extremely connected to a select few people in our households. I had a day at my office out of the house last week, the first full day that I can remember in our 3+ months of this pandemic. And I had just forgotten what it was like to go for several hours without interruptions, without hearing my preschoolers yelling at the top of their lungs or stomping around the house. And it really took that day for me to really realize how much I had been struggling with a lack of solitude or quiet or uninterrupted time to think, because I'd just been spending week after week after week bouncing back and forth between work and kids and household responsibilities, and that mostly in that same space. So these few months have exposed some things for me. Maybe they have for you too. For me, it's a need to grow my patience as a parent. It's a need to figure out how to switch off from work better in a job that can happen anytime and which is more unpredictable than ever right now. And I guess the other thing was my need to continue to draw strength from my faith so that I can be as loving and as present as I would like to be with my family, especially while we're under some of these different stressors of this time. So for today's session, I'm going to start with a big idea. We'll look at what the Bible has to say about it, and then get practical with what it might mean for you to live that way in your new normal. So here's the big idea that I want you to share with me, or at least to think about with me here. The idea is that there is nothing more important than the mark you leave on others, right? In your life, that there is nothing more important than the mark that you leave on other people. And I'm talking about the people that you are connected to, the people you interact with in one way or another. These are the people that you have the ability to affect either positively or negatively simply by who you are to them. Right? That's a powerful position to hold in someone else's life. There's nothing more important than the mark you leave on others. Now, at this point, some of you might be forming an objection in your head. Wait, how can that be the most important thing? Right? Aren't you the pastor? Isn't the most important thing God, believing in God, obeying God? Something like that should be the right answer, right? And fortunately for me, you don't have to take my word for it, because Jesus was asked this question. So why don't we look at his answer? Because on one occasion, some of Jesus' opponents, they were trying to trick him. They thought, well, if we can give him a hard enough question and he gives a wrong answer or a really unpopular answer, maybe that will undermine him. So they tried once and it didn't really work. They got together and they said, well, can we come up with an even harder question? And what they settled on was one of these big meaning of life types of questions, which are what we talked about in session 2 of this series. Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment in the law? What's the most important thing in Scripture, Jesus? What does God care about the most when it comes to how we live? So to read it directly from the Bible, Matthew 22:35-40. It says this, it says, one of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. He said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So by saying the second is like it, Jesus was basically saying that these two things were of the same nature, that these two commands were equally essential. So it's a tie. Love God with every part of you and love your neighbor as yourself. And that makes a certain amount of sense because you can't really have the first without the second. There is no such thing as a certain person who loves God with all their heart, soul, and mind, but who is not committed to loving their neighbor. If you believe that God made everyone and loves everyone, then you can't claim to love God while refusing to love others. You can claim it, but God will certainly know it's not true, and other people are going to notice and figure it out. There's a passage in the book of James about this related to the way we talk about others, which I think is especially important today in our online outrage insult culture. It says, "With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be." Now, Jesus made it very clear who our neighbor is in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where this injured Jewish man was ignored by a bunch of Jewish religious people who ought to have helped him, and he was saved by a Samaritan despite the racial conflict and discrimination between Samaritans and Jews. So your neighbor, the person you're called to love by God, is the person in front of you. It's the person you're connected to. It's the person who needs you, regardless of your differences, different nationality, race, religion, politics, ideology. None of these are an excuse. People are made in the image of God. They are loved by God. And if you can make any kind of mark on someone's life, they are your neighbor. So back to why I still feel good about my big idea, that the most important things, according to Jesus, are love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's why I think it's fair to say that there is nothing more important than the mark you leave on others, because that's really loving your neighbor as yourself. And that is some of the best evidence there is of someone who truly loves God. So this is true in the wider world, but it's also true for Christians specifically in our church community, because we're taught that we have this particular calling to get it right in that setting within the church. In 1 John 3:16-18, it reminds us of this. It says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, well, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So let's think now about what it means to love others and how we leave a mark on the people around us as we head into this new normal. I'm going to focus on only the things that you have any say over, which is you. How do your priorities, your attitudes, your actions leave a mark on others? And over these past few days, people have been making plans about how we're going to get together now that we can have these groups of 10 without social distancing. This is such a big change. And do you know who is in the highest demand to get together right now? It's encouraging people. It's people who add to the lives of others. It's people who can get through a whole conversation without complaining about something. It's people who are mindful of the mark that they leave on others with their words and actions. Some of you out there need to hear that while you need to be able to share your burdens with others, you cannot continually dump your burdens at the feet of other people and expect to have a healthy relationship. If you only have negative things to talk about, other people are going to stop wanting to take your calls. If you never really invest in them or say or do things that build them up, then they will keep you at a distance. If COVID-19 or life in general has just left you unable to be an encouraging and supportive part of a relationship, then well, then you're going to need real help with those issues from a counselor, a support group. You're going to need prayer and strength from God with that, because those are the things that will actually help with that. What you need is not more attention from the people you're seeking it from, but to learn how to be a healthy part of a relationship. We've had 3 months mostly at home now. And so for some people, I think it's worth asking, how many calls and texts and video calls did you make to family and friends for the purpose of brightening their day and encouraging them? And then how often did you just kind of wish that somebody else would do that for you? Because if that's a pretty one-sided number on either end, that might tell you something pretty important about how things were in your relationships in the old normal. And I think there's probably at least one other person out there who also needs to hear that in your new normal, you are not obligated to give time and energy to people who just drain you dry. Right? There may be a way to serve them in love, but unless God has clearly told you to sacrifice in this way for a season, you do not have to be unhealthy or miserable because of someone who wants more than you can give them freely. The most neighbor-loving thing that you can do sometimes for people is to refuse to let them overstep your healthy boundaries, because that's the only way that they might be confronted with the reality of their behavior, and it's the only way you are going to be able to give your best to the other people in your life. Now, it's Father's Day, so let me talk to you men and dads for a second. And I want to stress an attitude that I bring to this when I say I want to talk to you, because there is a verse from 1 Timothy where the Apostle Paul says this, and I think of it often. It says, "Here is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst." So what I want to say next doesn't come from someone who has it all figured out. It comes from someone who acknowledges that he can certainly be the worst. Right? I can be the worst in a way that I know other men struggle sometimes, which is approaching responsibilities and work as a place to prove myself, as a place to establish my value in the world in a way that can shortchange my relationships. Sometimes that gives me that awful compulsion to check my phone for no good reason while my kids are right in front of me, or to let myself get to the point where I'm physically present, but I am mentally gone. I'm not listening. I'm not engaging. You have that moment where you say, "Oh, wait, you've been talking to me for 2 minutes, honey? Sorry, I did not get a word of that." And can you tell that this is the sermon that I do before I go and take a little vacation? I do get it right a lot of the time, but sometimes I am the worst at this, and I want to do better, to grow and to mature in this way, because I'm convinced of the truth of today's big idea, that there is nothing more important than the mark I leave on others. And that starts with my family, because my role in those relationships is irreplaceable. As a pastor, there are a lot of things that I'd love to accomplish if the opportunities came along for it. Maybe I'll further my education and someday I'll be Dr. Scott. Maybe I'll get a chance to write a book or speak at a big conference or do some other notable thing. But I can live without any of that pretty happily, I think. I also hope that I'll largely be able to earn the respect of the leaders I work with, the members of however many congregations I serve. I would struggle a lot if I failed at that, but even that I could recover. What I want most is something else. What I want most, and what I deeply desire to achieve as a pastor, is to not ever down the road have my wife or kids wish that I had been something else. Because I know pastors' kids who wished that, who felt that they came second to the church, or they were made to jump through all these extra hoops so they didn't get to grow up in a normal way. And so if my family ever wished that I were something else, that would be truly a failure, the one that I don't want to have happen. Better, much better, that I quit, that I go work at Walmart, because God can raise up 100 people to replace me as a pastor, people who would be better at it. But God has given me, and only me, this opportunity to be a good husband and father to my family. So dads and men, I know that you're not the only ones who need to be reminded of this from time to time, but sometimes we are the worst for making a plan that pays the bills and provides those family opportunities and keeps the lawn mowed, but just kind of hopes that the relationships are going to work out. And that kind of plan puts the most important thing last. It causes you to focus on on all the things you do, which are in fact replaceable, and not on the one irreplaceable role you play in the lives of others. So if you've ever been there in any of those ways, and not just you men and dads, but anyone, well, then I challenge you to make a better plan for the new normal. Because there's nothing more important than the mark that you make on others. So what's causing you to leave a negative mark or preventing you from being a more positive influence in the relationships that you have going on or that matter to you most? Is it the number of hours that your household is trying to put into work and or suffering from job stresses that make you absent? Or the amount of childcare that has to happen for all of that to come together so that there's little time to all be together? I was just reading this week that something like half of workers are thinking about making changes to their jobs in their new normal, whether that's changing where they work or taking advantage of some new options for how they work. There's not going to be a better opportunity than now to start thinking about how this might happen with that work-life balance that we all talk about being important and struggle with. To change schedules, adjust how the family does some things, make a better plan that puts relationships first. I know in some people's old normal, you were buried under extracurricular activities too, between sports and hobbies and clubs and community groups and play dates and maybe even church stuff. But now you get to decide how many of those things you restart as they get going. What is going to serve your most important relationships best? And if you had a lack of relationships going into this pandemic, well, then as things get going, you could think hard about where you're going to volunteer, where you're going to participate and connect with other people, and how you would intentionally build up relationships and friendships in those spaces so that you can be a blessing to others and receive that blessing in return. And then there's the question of how we nurture those relationships that we already have. Are you making a positive mark on those people closest to you, or are you basically expecting other people to take care of you most of the time? Are you an encourager and a cheerleader, or a complainer and a wet blanket? Right? Do you allow other people to share burdens, or do you really just try to dump yours and run? This might be a good time to give some thought to what is it like to be your friend, to be your spouse, to be your parent, to be your kid. Is that something that is a blessing to those people, or are there things that you could do better to make sure that the marks you leave on those relationships are good ones? Your new normal could have much better relationships simply by what you bring to the ones you already have if you pay attention to that mark that you're leaving on them. Now, I've obviously not captured every single thing about how to have better relationships in your new normal, but hopefully I found something that applies to you. What's left is to remember that it's not enough to just try to live this out through your willpower or through just making a better plan. I mean, those might help you, but they will also fall short. That's because while there is nothing more important than the mark you leave on others, we have already heard that there is something equally important. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. There are all kinds of things that you can figure out how to do better with education and support and hard work and careful planning. But I believe that sin is a real thing, that we all experience a fundamental brokenness, that it sometimes blinds us to what is right, and it can even prevent us from doing what we want to do, what we believe is right. I don't know if there's a Bible verse that I feel is more real and raw than Romans 7:15. It's where the Apostle Paul says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And by the second or third hour at home with my daughter, some days I have said something like that at some point. So let me put it this way. You cannot love your neighbor as yourself by yourself. By yourself, you will fall short of what love requires. By yourself, you will forget, or you will refuse to acknowledge who your neighbor is, at least some of the time. To do our actual best, you need to know the love of the one who made and loved your neighbors first, the God who wants to help each one of us leave the right mark on the people around us. In Jesus, we see just how far love can go. Jesus laid down his life. And because he went to the cross, because he stayed on the cross, we can all have hope. We can have hope for an abundant and eternal life if we believe and if we follow him. Faith in Jesus restores broken relationships. It restored the broken relationship with God, and it empowers and guides us toward repairing and improving and restoring our relationships with others. And they go together. Deepening your relationship with God gives life to all of your other relationships. Maybe that's what your old normal was missing. So I'd like to pray for you and for your most important relationships. Loving God, I don't believe there's anything more important than the mark we leave on others. But equally important is knowing you, loving you, and receiving your strength and your grace, which helps us to be our best for those people who we care about, for those people around us, for those people that you have called us to love. So first off, God, if there is someone out there today who is not in a good relationship with you, God, may that be the starting place. May you give them a desire to know you. May you help them to know that you are ready to welcome them back, that you are ready to extend forgiveness and grace, and that you are their loving Father. And God, if there are other relationships that are strained by this time, whether it's through loneliness, whether it's through too much togetherness, God, I pray that you would give patience and peace to people, that you would give them a desire to strengthen and grow those, and that you would help them make wise decisions about their new normal.
No matter how old we are, we always remember what our dads say and do.
My dad is more like Jesus than your dad.
Nuh-uh. My dad doesn't let anybody eat any food until we pray for it.
My dad prays for 1 minute every day.
You know what? Our church has pancakes.
This is what my sister and mom use for their blush. My dad says that mean kids never know what they're talking about, because their parents don't know what they're talking about either.
My dad says to punch meanies in the face. Then my mom says, don't ever do that. And my dad goes to timeout.
My dad's beard is itchy whenever he kisses me.
My dad takes me to church so we could learn to be just like Jesus.
My daddy prays for me. Then he makes me stop talking and go to bed. Then I get a flashlight and read my comic book.
That's a sin. He's sinning.
No, I'm not.
Sinner.
No, I'm not.
R2, R2, R2.
I'm not.
My dad said that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it.
My dad never stays mad at me.
My dad taught me to forgive because Jesus forgives us every time we ask.
I want a mohawk.
I wish I had hair.
It's okay. Your hair will probably grow back.
Thanks for being our dads for all our lives.